The Germans believed it was impossible. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, rising 100 feet above the crashing waves of Normandy, were nature's fortress. Smooth, sheer rock, reinforced with barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and artillery aimed at the sea. No army could ever climb them. But on June 6, 1944, as the Allied invasion of Europe began, a small group of American Rangers looked up at those cliffs and saw something different. They didn't see the impossible. They saw their mission. And before the morning was over, they would do what the enemy thought could never be done: scale those cliffs under fire, seize the guns, and change the course of D-Day itself. This is the story of the men who climbed through hell, and of the fortress the Germans thought would never fall. The cliffs rose like the edge of the world, jagged, sheer, and utterly unforgiving. The cold waters of the English Channel pounded their base, sending spray high into the air, as if nature itself was guarding the French coastline. Pointe du Hoc, the Germans called it. To them, it was untouchable, a fortress carved not by men but by the earth. From its summit, artillery batteries commanded a view of both Omaha and Utah Beach, the two sectors where American forces would soon attempt the largest amphibious assault in history. Any ship or landing craft that came into range could be obliterated in minutes. The Nazis had turned this natural fortress into a machine of destruction, and they believed no enemy would ever take it. By 1943, German engineers had poured tons of concrete into the cliffs, transforming them into a fortress of steel and stone. 6 155mm guns were mounted in armored casemates, each capable of firing shells more than 10 miles. Machine gun nests dotted the edges, while trenches and underground bunkers linked every position. The cliffs themselves were nearly 100 feet tall, vertical walls of limestone with barely a ledge to grip. On top of that, barbed wire, mines, and anti-landing obstacles ringed the perimeter. To German commanders, it was the perfect defense, an impregnable stronghold that stood as both a weapon and a warning. To even attempt to scale those cliffs under fire seemed like madness. But on the other side of the channel, in the planning rooms of Allied command, that very target began to draw attention. Intelligence reports, photographs, and aerial reconnaissance revealed the full danger of Pointe du Hoc. Those guns, if left operational, could annihilate the entire right flank of the D-Day invasion before it even reached shore. General Omar Bradley and the planners of Operation Overlord understood it clearly: if the guns fired freely on June 6, the beaches could become killing fields. Something had to be done. And so, they conceived one of the most daring missions of the war, an assault that defied every logic of warfare. The task fell to a small, elite force within the U.S. Army, the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, was a calm, quiet Texan known for his precision and grit. When the order came down to storm the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, he didn't flinch. "We'll get it done," he told his men, though everyone in the room understood what that meant. It wasn't a boast. It was a sentence. To climb 100 feet of vertical rock under enemy fire seemed suicidal. But the Rangers weren't ordinary soldiers, they were volunteers trained for impossible tasks. Their training in the months before D-Day bordered on brutality. On the coasts of England and Scotland, Rudder's Rangers practiced cliff assaults over and over again, climbing ropes and ladders slick with seawater, sometimes in full combat gear. They drilled for speed, for coordination, for the muscle memory that might save a life when chaos took over. They learned to fire grappling hooks from rocket launchers and use them to scale sheer surfaces. They trained in silence, often in cold rain and fog, knowing that the real cliffs would be higher, slicker, and far deadlier. Back at Pointe du Hoc, the Germans watched the sea each day and saw only the vast gray expanse of the channel. To them, the idea of an invasion landing beneath those cliffs was absurd. Even if enemy ships approached, the artillery could obliterate them before they ever reached shore. Their confidence was absolute. "No one could climb this wall," a German officer wrote in his report. "The sea protects us." They didn't know that, across that same sea, men were preparing to prove them wrong. As the days ticked down toward June 6, 1944, the Allied war machine gathered like a storm. Troop transports, bombers, landing craft, and tanks filled the ports of southern England. Code names whispered through the camps: Neptune, Overlord, Omaha, Utah. The Rangers received their final briefings in secrecy. Their mission was simple in words but terrifying in meaning: land beneath Pointe du Hoc, scale the cliffs, destroy the guns. Timing was everything. They would go in ahead of the main invasion, climbing before the first waves hit the beaches. The entire right flank of the Allied landings would depend on their success. The night before the invasion, the sea was restless, the air thick with salt and anticipation. In their landing craft, the Rangers packed their ropes, grappling hooks, and weapons. Some carried photos of loved ones tucked into their pockets, others sat in silence, staring into the darkness, the weight of history pressing down on them. Rudder moved among them quietly, offering words of steadiness. There was no grand speech, no promise of glory, only the knowledge that what they were about to attempt had never been done before. As the first light of dawn approached, the sound of engines rolled across the water. The horizon began to glow faintly, revealing the dark outline of the cliffs ahead. The Rangers could see the fortress rising from the mist, its silhouette jagged and menacing against the early morning sky. From this distance, it looked impossible even to reach the base, let alone climb to the top. The surf was rough, the boats bucking wildly as they drew closer. Above, the cliffs stood silent. Somewhere up there, German soldiers waited behind their guns, unaware that the most audacious assault of the entire invasion was about to begin beneath their feet. The Rangers tightened their grips on their ropes. The officers checked their watches. Engines roared louder as the landing craft surged toward the shore. The sea exploded with gunfire. And in that instant, the legend of Pointe du Hoc began, not in triumph, but in the raw, deafening chaos of men charging toward the impossible. The sea was a churning mass of gray and foam as the landing craft pitched violently in the swells. Cold spray lashed the faces of the men inside, mixing with the acrid smell of fuel and cordite. The Rangers crouched low, clutching their weapons and ropes, eyes fixed on the looming shadow ahead. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc rose like a dark wall out of the morning mist, sheer, forbidding, and silent except for the thunder of the surf below. Overhead, the sky was streaked with smoke trails from Allied bombers that had already unleashed their payloads. But to the Rangers' dismay, the bombardment had done little. The German positions still stood, their concrete casemates unbroken, the enemy guns waiting. At 6:30 a.m., as the first waves of the D-Day invasion hit the beaches of Normandy, the Rangers' landing craft veered toward their target. A powerful current dragged them off course, forcing them to fight the sea just to stay aligned with the cliffs. Enemy artillery, hidden inland, began to find its mark. Shells burst around them, geysers of water rising higher than the boats. Shrapnel whistled through the air, splashing into the channel. One landing craft was hit directly, disappearing in a flash of fire and smoke. Others were damaged, leaking seawater as the men inside bailed frantically with their helmets. The mission had barely begun, and already it was teetering on disaster. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder stood near the bow of his lead craft, shouting orders above the roar of engines. His voice was calm, steady, cutting through the panic. "We're going in," he called. The men tightened their grips. Ahead, the cliffs loomed larger, their bases shrouded in mist and gunfire. German defenders were awake now. Muzzle flashes lit the edges of the heights, machine guns raking the water, mortars thumping from hidden pits. The air turned to chaos, a deafening symphony of gunfire, surf, and shouted commands. When the landing craft finally ground to a halt on the shingle at the base of the cliffs, the scene was pandemonium. Men leapt into waist-deep water, wading through waves that pulled at their ropes and equipment. The cliffs towered directly above them, wet, slick, and nearly vertical. Small explosions threw up sprays of rock and debris as German defenders dropped grenades and fired down blindly. Every step felt exposed, every heartbeat louder than the guns. Yet the Rangers moved with purpose, trained for this exact moment. They fired grappling hooks into the heights, the rockets hissing upward. Some ropes caught immediately, wrapping around ledges or snagging on bushes at the top. Others fell short or tore loose, plunging back into the surf. The men grabbed hold of what they could and began to climb. It was slow, grueling work, every foot gained through sheer willpower. Bullets whipped past, striking the rock with sharp cracks. Grenades exploded above, showering them with dirt and stone. A few Rangers lost their grip, falling back into the water below, their bodies swallowed by the surf. But the others climbed harder, faster, teeth clenched, muscles burning. One Ranger, his rope severed by machine gun fire, slammed into the cliff face, swung wildly, and then reached out to grab another line, refusing to fall. Another soldier, hit in the shoulder, kept climbing with one arm, his blood slicking the rope. They used knives to dig into cracks, boots scraping for purchase, hearts pounding with the rhythm of survival. At the top, German soldiers leaned over the edge, trying to cut ropes, shouting in alarm as they saw more and more Rangers ascending from the smoke below. A few men had brought scaling ladders, lightweight aluminum structures modified from London fire departments. They extended them against the cliff face, steadying them as best they could in the surf. Under covering fire from those still on the boats, the first climbers scrambled upward, sometimes pushing their comrades ahead of them. The noise was overwhelming, rifles cracking, mortars whistling, men shouting through the din. Yet amid the chaos, discipline held. Each man knew his task, every movement drilled into muscle memory. As the first Rangers reached the top, the battle changed. Bursting over the edge, they fired immediately, clearing the nearest trenches and bunkers. Germans scattered, some throwing grenades, others retreating into the labyrinth of concrete positions. The Rangers fanned out, dragging ropes over the edge so others could climb faster. More men hauled themselves up, mud-smeared, gasping for breath. Within minutes, small groups had formed around the plateau, fighting through the maze of defenses. But confusion reigned. Smoke from the bombardment still hung heavy over the cliffs, mixing with the haze of gunfire. Communication was nearly impossible. Radios crackled with static. Many units were cut off entirely, unaware of whether the landings below had succeeded or failed. Rudder himself managed to reach the summit, directing his men as best he could amid the chaos. He ordered them to push inland, find the artillery, and destroy it before it could fire on the beaches. The Rangers obeyed without hesitation, even as counterattacks began to form around them. The Germans regrouped quickly. From hidden bunkers, they poured fire into the advancing Rangers. Snipers picked targets from camouflaged nests. Mortar shells burst among the craters, flinging dirt and bodies into the air. The Rangers fought back with grenades and rifles, their training and aggression keeping them alive. Every bunker they cleared, every trench they took, was another step toward their objective, but the price was high. Men fell in twos and threes, wounded or dead, as others took their places. Down below, the sea was now littered with wreckage, burning boats, floating debris, the cries of wounded men carried by the waves. The cliffs smoked and burned, scarred by explosions and gunfire. To any observer, it seemed impossible that anyone could have climbed through that inferno and lived. But above, against all logic, the Rangers were doing it. They fought from crater to crater, calling out to one another, pressing forward inch by inch. By mid-morning, the first phase of the mission was complete, the cliffs had been taken. The Rangers stood, breathless and bloodied, atop Pointe du Hoc. But as they looked around, they realized something was wrong. The great guns that had been their target were nowhere to be seen. The casemates were empty, the barrels gone. They had climbed through hell for this moment, and now the very thing they came to destroy had vanished. For a long moment, the Rangers could only stare at the empty gun emplacements in disbelief. The massive casemates that had been their target, those concrete monsters built to protect the German 155mm artillery, stood silent and hollow. Inside, there were only empty shells of steel and scattered ammunition crates. The guns that were supposed to command the invasion beaches, the weapons that had justified one of the most dangerous assaults of D-Day, were gone. The confusion was instant. Had the bombers destroyed them earlier? Had they been moved? Or had the entire mission been a deception, a misreading of German plans? Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder climbed out of the smoke and rubble and made his way across the shattered plateau, scanning the scene. The air smelled of cordite and burning oil. His men were spread thin, securing trenches and fending off pockets of resistance. German defenders were still firing from hidden bunkers, and every few seconds, the ground shuddered under mortar fire. The noise was deafening. Rudder's radio crackled, but the signal was weak. Reports came in fragments, half a platoon missing here, heavy casualties there. Still, his men pushed forward, searching the complex for any trace of the missing artillery. The top of Pointe du Hoc was a labyrinth of confusion. Craters from the pre-invasion bombardment had torn the ground into a moonscape. Trenches zigzagged between bunkers, and everywhere lay the debris of battle, helmets, spent shells, shattered rifles, and the bodies of friend and foe alike. The Rangers had only a fraction of their original strength left, but the adrenaline of the assault still coursed through them. They moved with purpose, checking every dugout, every corner, determined not to fail. If the guns were still capable of firing somewhere inland, the beaches below, Omaha and Utah, were still in danger. Two men, Sergeant Leonard Lommel and Sergeant Jack Kuhn, decided to search beyond the immediate defenses. Moving cautiously through the haze, they followed a dirt path leading inland from the fortifications. It wound through hedgerows and small farm fields, eerily quiet compared to the chaos behind them. The sound of battle faded into the distance, replaced by the rustle of wind through grass and the distant thunder of artillery from the beaches. Then, through the smoke and trees, they saw them. Half a mile from the cliff's edge, hidden under camouflage netting and surrounded by farm wagons, sat the guns, 5 of them, perfectly intact, aimed toward the beaches but unmanned. Their wooden wheels were splintered from use, but the barrels gleamed darkly in the light. The discovery hit them like a surge of electricity. These were the weapons that could still massacre thousands of men landing below. There was no time to call for engineers, no time to wait for orders. The two Rangers acted. Using thermite grenades, Lommel and Kuhn worked methodically, setting the explosives against the gears and breeches of each gun. When the grenades went off, molten metal flooded the mechanisms, welding them into useless hulks. One by one, the great cannons were silenced without a single shot fired. When they were done, the two men took a final look at the smoldering barrels and ran back toward the cliffs to report. Their message, when it reached Rudder, was short but triumphant: mission accomplished. Guns destroyed. The relief was momentary. Even as the message went out, German counterattacks began to form. Infantry units, recovering from the morning's shock, pushed back toward the cliffs, supported by snipers and mortars. The Rangers, still isolated and short on supplies, had to fight off assaults from every direction. Many had run out of rifle ammunition and resorted to scavenging from the fallen. Grenades were passed hand to hand like gold. Some used captured German weapons, their unfamiliar weight and sound only adding to the confusion. Radio contact with Allied command was intermittent at best. The Rangers' signals were too weak to reach the ships offshore, and the rising tide had scattered their support boats. Reinforcements from Omaha Beach were delayed by enemy fire and confusion. For hours, the men of Pointe du Hoc were alone. They dug in around the shattered fortifications, turning craters into foxholes, using captured bunkers as shelters. The wounded were dragged into makeshift aid stations, where medics worked with whatever supplies they had left. The Germans attacked again and again. Mortar rounds burst among the defenders, throwing up clouds of dirt and smoke. Machine gun fire raked across the open ground. Each attack was met with grim determination. The Rangers held their positions, firing until their rifles were too hot to touch. When the ammunition ran out, they waited in silence, listening for footsteps in the smoke, then sprang up to fight hand to hand. Every inch of the cliff top was contested, every moment a test of endurance. Through it all, Rudder moved among his men, calm and steady despite the chaos. His uniform was caked in mud, his voice hoarse from shouting, but his presence steadied those around him. He refused to consider retreat or surrender. They had completed their mission, but now they would hold, no matter the cost. The Germans threw everything they had at the plateau, desperate to reclaim what they had lost, but the Rangers' defense was unbreakable. By nightfall, the sky glowed red from the fires below. The sound of battle drifted over the sea, where Allied ships continued to hammer the coastline. The Rangers huddled in their positions, cold, hungry, and exhausted. They had climbed 100 feet of sheer cliff, fought their way through machine gun nests, destroyed the guns, and now found themselves surrounded. But still, they did not yield. Below, on the beaches, thousands of American soldiers continued to fight their own battles, unaware that the men atop Pointe du Hoc had already saved them from catastrophe. The guns that could have rained destruction down on the landing craft now lay twisted and useless, destroyed by 2 men with a handful of grenades. Above the cliffs, the Rangers tightened their grip on the positions they had bled to take. The German belief that Pointe du Hoc was untouchable had shattered, but the cost of proving it had only just begun. The night after the assault was long, cold, and heavy with the scent of smoke and sea salt. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc were now silent except for the wind and the occasional burst of gunfire from distant skirmishes. The Rangers, soaked to the bone, dug deeper into their craters and trenches, turning the shattered plateau into a fortress of their own. Every man was exhausted, physically broken, mentally frayed, but none dared sleep deeply. They knew the Germans would not let them hold this ground without a fight. In the darkness, flares arched over the cliff top, bathing the landscape in eerie white light. Shadows flickered across the ruins of the gun emplacements, revealing the aftermath of the battle. Bodies lay where they had fallen, German and American alike, their outlines sharp against the mud. In the faint light, medics moved quietly, tending to the wounded, wrapping bandages with trembling hands. Somewhere near the edge, a ranger whispered a prayer over a fallen comrade before slipping back into his foxhole. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder crouched near his command post, a shallow depression reinforced with planks and sandbags, and studied the flickering light of a field map. His uniform was soaked, his helmet dented, and his face smeared with grime. The radio beside him crackled intermittently, the voice on the other end faint and broken. Reinforcements were promised, but the situation below was chaotic. Omaha Beach had been a slaughterhouse, and the landings there were far behind schedule. For the men on Pointe du Hoc, it meant one thing: they were on their own. The Germans began probing the perimeter again at dawn. Small groups crept through the smoke and debris, testing the Rangers' defenses. Every shot fired echoed off the cliffs, rolling down toward the sea. The Rangers replied with rifles, machine guns, and the few grenades they had left. Ammunition was scarce now. Some men counted their remaining rounds like precious currency, firing only when absolutely sure of a target. When the guns fell silent, the only sound was the sea, crashing relentlessly against the rocks below. By mid-morning, the counterattacks grew bolder. German infantry surged forward in waves, shouting, firing from the hip, trying to dislodge the Americans from their precarious hold. Mortars rained down, throwing up fountains of earth and stone. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the ground, shaking loose debris from the cliff edge. The Rangers hugged the earth, returning fire between bursts, their eyes stinging from smoke and sweat. One bunker at the western edge became a focal point of the fighting. German troops tried repeatedly to retake it, advancing through the craters. A machine gun team inside, led by Sergeant Charles Parker, held them off with relentless bursts until their barrel glowed red. When the weapon jammed, Parker grabbed a rifle and kept firing, his men feeding him ammunition scavenged from the fallen. At one point, a German grenade rolled into the bunker, and without hesitation, Parker kicked it back out, seconds before it exploded. When the smoke cleared, the bunker still stood, its defenders bruised but unbroken. Elsewhere, the Rangers improvised with whatever they had. Mortars salvaged from the Germans were turned back against their former owners. Captured machine guns were mounted on broken tripods, firing from the rim of shell craters. When ammunition for American weapons ran out entirely, some Rangers scavenged German rifles, awkwardly adjusting to their unfamiliar sights and triggers. Every shot mattered. Every second of resistance bought more time. Communication remained almost non-existent. The main radio was damaged during the landing, and the smaller sets were unreliable. Runners, men willing to risk the open ground, were sent between positions, carrying scraps of information and whispered updates. More than once, they were caught in the open, cut down by snipers hiding in the ruins. Still, others took their place, dashing across the field with messages clutched in trembling hands. The Germans shifted tactics, pulling back their infantry and bringing up heavier weapons. Artillery fire began to pound the cliff top again, shells bursting in deafening rhythm. Each explosion sent showers of dirt and rock cascading over the defenders. The Rangers ducked low, their helmets ringing from the concussions. Some men were buried briefly by falling debris, dug out by their comrades amid the chaos. The ground itself seemed to shudder under the bombardment, and yet the Americans clung to it with the same tenacity that had brought them up the cliffs in the first place. By afternoon, smoke covered everything. The air was thick with it, gray and choking. It clung to uniforms, to weapons, to the very skin of the living and the dead. The Rangers fought half-blind, guided by sound and instinct. Somewhere in the haze, Rudder's voice cut through, calm but iron-hard, rallying his men. "Hold what we've taken," he said simply. It wasn't an order, it was a promise. Hours bled into one another. The Germans attacked again at dusk, emerging like ghosts from the haze, their shouts rising above the noise. The Rangers fired until the last of their ammunition was gone, then fought with knives and bayonets, even bare hands. When it ended, silence fell once more, broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the distant thump of artillery inland. The survivors counted what remained, fewer than half their number still standing, many of them wounded, but every position still held. Night came again, and with it the cold. The men wrapped themselves in blankets scavenged from the dead, huddling together for warmth. Some dozed briefly, waking at the slightest sound. Others stared out over the edge of the cliffs, where the Black Sea stretched endlessly below. They had scaled those cliffs in the face of fire, fought an army that refused to yield, and still stood their ground. Somewhere beyond the darkness, they could hear the rumble of American armor moving inland, the faint, distant sound of reinforcements finally coming. But until they arrived, Pointe du Hoc remained theirs, and theirs alone to defend. Dawn broke over Pointe du Hoc on June 8, 1944, with a pale, cold light that revealed the full devastation of the battlefield. Smoke drifted across the plateau in slow, ghostly ribbons. The ground, once green with coastal grass, was now nothing but churned mud, shattered rock, and craters deep enough to swallow a man whole. Deadly silence hung in the air, broken only by the hiss of the wind and the distant rumble of naval guns offshore. The Rangers, what was left of them, moved like shadows through the wreckage. Their faces were gaunt, their uniforms torn and blackened, eyes sunken from exhaustion and sleeplessness. They had held the cliffs for nearly 2 days, isolated, battered, and nearly out of supplies. But they were still there. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder was barely recognizable, mud-caked, bandaged, and limping as he made his way between positions. His men saluted him with weary nods, some too weak to stand. They had started the mission with 225 Rangers. Fewer than 90 were still capable of fighting. Yet not a single one spoke of retreat. They had accomplished the impossible, climbed 100-foot cliffs under fire, destroyed the guns that threatened the invasion beaches, and held against counterattack after counterattack. But now, they were close to collapse. Ammunition was almost gone. Food was gone. Water was running out. Still, when a sentry called out that German troops were massing again beyond the fields, the Rangers gripped their rifles and prepared to fight one more time. The next German assault came mid-morning. It started with artillery fire from inland, followed by a wave of infantry advancing through the smoke. The Rangers met them with the last of their ammunition. Each man fired deliberately, conserving rounds, picking targets through the haze. When their rifles clicked empty, they scavenged weapons from the fallen, American or German, it didn't matter. The sound of battle rolled across the cliffs, echoing over the sea. Mortar shells burst in geysers of dirt and flame. The air filled with the sharp crack of machine guns and the scream of ricocheting bullets. In the chaos, Sergeant Jack Kuhn, one of the men who had destroyed the guns days before, moved between positions, shouting encouragement, throwing grenades where the enemy gathered. "Hold the line," he yelled, his voice raw. Beside him, younger Rangers fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They had come too far, lost too many, to give up now. One man, hit in the leg, refused to crawl to safety until his friends were clear. Another, his weapon jammed, swung it like a club at a German soldier who had breached the perimeter. The fighting was close, brutal, and without mercy. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the attack faltered. The Germans pulled back, leaving their dead scattered across the cratered ground. The Rangers didn't cheer, they didn't have the strength for it. They simply reloaded, patched the wounded, and waited for the next one. But this time, the counterattack never came. From the distance came a new sound, a low rumble that grew louder with every second. The Rangers froze, listening. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't German tanks. It was the deep, steady grind of engines, American engines. Reinforcements were finally coming. Over the rise appeared the first columns of U.S. troops from Omaha Beach, their helmets glinting in the morning light. Trucks and half-tracks rolled forward cautiously, their commanders scanning for snipers. The sight hit the Rangers like a wave of relief. Some stood up and waved, others just slumped where they sat, overcome with exhaustion. When the first relief units reached them, the newcomers could scarcely believe what they saw. The men of the 2nd and 5th Ranger battalions looked like ghosts, filthy, hollow-eyed, and streaked with soot, but they were alive. Medical teams rushed in immediately, tending to the wounded. Stretchers were laid out across the plateau. Canteens were passed around, and for many of the men, the first sip of clean water in days brought tears to their eyes. Yet even in those moments of reprieve, they stayed alert. German snipers still lurked in the fields beyond, and occasional shots cracked through the morning air. The Rangers ducked instinctively, their nerves so frayed that every sound made them flinch. When higher command officers finally arrived, they were stunned by what they found. The cliffs that the Germans had called impregnable were now under American control. The massive artillery that could have devastated Omaha and Utah beaches was nothing but twisted metal. The Rangers had done their job, against every possible odd. Rudder, barely able to stand, reported their status in a voice hoarse from days of shouting. "Mission accomplished," he said simply. Word of the feat spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers across Normandy began talking about the men who had climbed the unclimbable cliffs. Journalists who visited in the following days described the battlefield as something from another world, burned, cratered, and littered with the wreckage of war. One correspondent wrote that Pointe du Hoc looked as if the very earth had been torn open and reshaped by the courage of men. For the Germans who had once believed those cliffs were unassailable, the shock was total. Captured prisoners later admitted that they never thought an attack from the sea was possible there. They had assumed the Americans would bypass Pointe du Hoc entirely. Instead, they watched in disbelief as the Rangers scaled the vertical walls through smoke and gunfire, pulling themselves upward like ghosts rising from the surf. It shattered the illusion of invincibility that had protected that stretch of coast. When General Omar Bradley toured the site days later, he was speechless. Standing on the edge of the cliffs, he looked down at the sea and said quietly, "These are the men who saved D-Day." The Rangers who heard him barely reacted. They were too tired, too drained. Many had already been evacuated for medical care. The rest sat among the ruins, polishing their weapons, repairing gear, or writing letters home. They did not see themselves as heroes. They had come to do a job, and somehow, against all logic, they had done it. As the reinforcements took over the defenses and supplies arrived from the beaches, the surviving Rangers finally allowed themselves to rest. They stretched out on the cold ground, staring up at the gray sky, listening to the distant rumble of the continuing war inland. Around them, the smoke still lingered, and the sea still crashed below the cliffs they had conquered. The price had been terrible, but the impossible had been done. And for the first time in days, the men of Pointe du Hoc could close their eyes, not in exhaustion, but in the quiet knowledge that they had changed the course of history. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc were supposed to be nature's fortress. But in the end, it wasn't the rock that mattered, it was the will of the men who refused to let go. They climbed not for glory, but for victory. And in doing so, they redefined the meaning of the impossible.